Welcome back to Human Biology with Dr. B. We're talking about bones today, and specifically the skeletal system. So, what are the functions of bones? If you think about how you move and how you stand, how you lay down, you realize very quickly the importance of bones to everything that you do. Now, the skeleton is a framework of bones and cartilage, and the main functions that they perform is number one, it supports all the soft tissues. Think about your ribs. They protect and support your lungs and your heart, which are very important underneath. It provides a place for attachment of muscles. Without the bones, we would be a soft mess of a heap on the floor. And the bones allow for a lever system to allow us to move. It also protects the internal organs. Think about your ribs again. Think about your abdominals wrapping all the way around, attaching at your vertebra. It stores mineral and fat. This is where we have yellow bone marrow, which stores fats and allows for shock absorption in your long bones, as well as minerals, calcium, phosphate, on and on. And certain bones can produce blood cells in the red bone marrow. This is primarily of importance within children where red bone marrow is more prevalent. However, in adults, this is also how we produce red blood cells, with the red bone marrow being located in only specific bones and not all of them. So the bone structure, there are 206 bones that vary in shape and size throughout your body. There are a number of different types and shapes of bones. We have flat bones, like your skull. We have irregular bones, such as in your vertebrate. We have long bones, such as in your femur and your humerus. We have sesamoid bones, such as in your patella. And we have wormian or sutural bones, which are in the sutures of your skull. They consist of both compact and spongy bone, and this is in proportion to the bone size and the function of the bone. So compact bone, the first type, it has a very dense outer layer and forms the shaft of the long bones. The compact bone is the external portion of every single bone, and it depends on the different type of bone, whether it's a flat bone or a long bone, etc., how much and the distribution of the compact bone. The compact bone is always covered by the periosteum, which is then contiguous with the tendon, which is contiguous with the epimysium, which surrounds each and every muscle in and of itself. So that way the muscles can act on the bones to create a lever system. And then spongy bone is more internal, and it's a lattice work. It literally looks like a sponge. And this sponge is full of trabeculae that allow for the red bone marrow to have a place to exist, as well as the yellow bone marrow. The spongy bone is found in the flat bones, as well as the long bones. However, as we discovered in lab, the flat bones have much less, ratio-wise, spongy bone, and this has everything to do with the function of that particular bone. Now, despite the fact that bones are hard and seem to be just more like a cementing system, bones are living. They are created of cells, and they're made hard by the minerals deposited there. The hardness is from what we call a non-living component, which is calcium and phosphorus salts, as well as strands of collagen. Now, the strands of collagen that you can see here wrap around in a circular manner, and they are opposite to each other. So we have these strands moving diagonally this way, these strands moving diagonally, and then these moving in a different direction as we move in concentric circles. Now, the collagen is a very stretchy, shear force resistant protein. And the collagen allows for a framework on which these calcium and phosphorus salts, which we call hydroxyapatite, to be deposited to allow for a very firm, hard matrix to be formed. Down here, you can see this is an actual micrograph of what we call an osteon. You can see the osteon right here and another one right here. And this is the cartoon of it. And you can see the lamella around the outside. These are the circular lines. You can see the canaliculi extending from each osteocyte. These are the tiny little vein-like things. And then in the center, you can see the central canal. Now, if you were to look at these, I'm not sure an untrained eye would recognize this as bone. Someone might think that this could be a tree, because honestly, there's nothing new under the sun. These concentric circles are very, very stable. And you can also see the osteoclasts and blasts around the outside. Osteoclasts will remove bone tissue and return calcium and phosphorus to the blood, and osteoblasts will lay bone down. Yep, and as I mentioned, this is the osteon. It's the structural unit of the compact bone, concentric circles around the central canal. Now, fetal bone development. Isn't this an amazing picture? Now, during embryonic development, the skeleton is first made up of cartilage, and this is how bone grows throughout the lifetime. It lays down cartilage, which then has a lot of collagenous fibers in it, and that forms the framework onto which we call it calcification. The calcium and phosphorus salts will be laid down. Now, cartilage cells are capable of dividing, which is why bone initially is cartilage, because mature bone cells do not divide. They remain stable because they're in a hard non-living matrix, so there's nowhere for them to go. And then after the 3rd month of fetal development, the cartilage is gradually replaced through birth and even after birth by bone. And here is the bone development. So there's 2 regions of cartilage. There's the articular surfaces and the epiphyseal plate. Now the articular surfaces will be here onto which the bones will meet and form joints. And then the epiphyseal plate is found at the ends of each of the long bones, and this is also what we call the growth plate. Now, growth is stimulated by a number of hormones. There's growth hormone, affects every single cell in your body and allows for growth and development and expansion. Thyroid hormones ensure that the bones are in the proper proportions. And sex hormones prompt and then also stop the growth spurt that occurs in puberty. Now, if we look over here at this picture, you can see that at 2 months during fetal development, it is simply a collagenous model, or the collagen and the cartilage lay down this very bendy matrix. And at about 3 months, the bone color begins from the inside and outside, laying down the hydroxyapatite in order to make the bones hard. At 9 months, you can see that a large proportion of the bone is in fact still cartilage. And then 9 months, and then 4 weeks later at birth, because fetal development is in fact 10 months, 40 weeks. At birth, you can see the beginning up here of spongy bone in each of the epiphyses. So we have the diaphysis, the long shaft, and the epiphyses at the end. And here during childhood, you can see the growth plate. Now, the growth plate on the long bones is typically where children can break a bone, because it is still cartilage and it has not hardened yet. You can see the epiphyseal plates there. And within the center of a long bone, we have what's called the medullary canal, which is where the neurons and blood vessels move into and through the bone. Now, in the same way that bones grow and develop, fractures are repaired. The first thing that happens with any injury in the body is a blood clot forms. And this blood clot will then, the fibroblasts, which help lay down the matrix to prevent further bleeding, will secrete a lot more collagen than typical for a regular callus, or a regular scab, if you will, on your skin. And this will form a callus. And as you can see here, we have a blood clot forming, and then we have the fibrocartilaginous callus. Then the osteoblast will eventually transform this cartilage into bone, and the bone continuously remodels. So after a break in the bone, it can take up to 2 years for the bone to return to its normal shape, because bones are continuously remodeled, even in adults. So what does bone remodeling mean? It's a continuous process. That means that new bone is deposited by osteoblasts and old bone is broken down by osteoclasts. We talked a little bit about this in class, and I asked if anyone had ever seen The Biggest Loser. And initially, at the beginning of the season of The Biggest Loser, you see these larger bodies, and you can physically see and feel how large their bones are. Now, at the end of the season, 6 months later, they have these much tinier bodies, but their bones, their hips, and their legs almost look like they're bowed. And the reason why their legs are bowed, number one, is because they have lost weight incredibly quickly, which I have opinions on. And number 2 is that their bone hasn't had time to remodel to fit their new body shape. Because throughout the lifetime, bones are continuously changing. So if you begin a weightlifting routine or a resistance exercise routine in your life, your bones will remodel based on how much weight and how much resistance you put on those bones. And as I mentioned in class, this is the only way for women to actively combat osteoporosis. By triggering osteoblasts to lay down more bone in response to the decrease in estrogen and the decrease in bone mass, by putting resistance or weight on the muscles which are attached to the bones. Now, bone remodeling repairs tiny cracks as well as can help regulate the blood calcium levels. And blood calcium levels are incredibly important for every single muscle in your body because they work on a release of calcium in order to get the muscle to contract. The bones, as we talked about, are the biggest repository for calcium in the body. Bone tissue will also form in response to stress on the bone. Now, stress on the bone, every time we hear stress, we have a negative connotation of that. But stress in this case means any type of resistance. And resistance on your bones, on your muscles, is actually a really beneficial thing for you because it triggers osteoblasts to lay down more bone and to make those bones harder and thicker. And when there's no resistance put on the bone and no resistance put on the muscle and no weight put on the body, this bone is resorbed in the absence of stress. So it becomes very, very important as we age and as we live to put resistance and stress on the bones. And there are 2 hormones that are involved in this process. We have calcitonin, which decreases the blood calcium levels. That means calcitonin puts calcium into the bones. And parathyroid hormone increases blood calcium levels by taking calcium from the bones and putting it into the blood. So here's a skeleton, which is divided into 2 major divisions. We have the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. The axial skeleton is everything that moves in the axis, right here, up and down. So we have the skull, the vertebral columns, the sternum, and the ribs, everything right here. And the appendicular skeleton is everything out on the edges. So we have the pectoral girdle, and we have the pelvic girdle, plus the attaching limbs. Which brings us to joints. A joint is defined as anywhere that bones meet. We have 3 different types. We have fibrous joints. These are held together by fibrous connective tissue. They have no joint cavity and they do not permit movement. A great example of this is your skull. I don't know if you've noticed, but the bones of your skull don't really move, for which we're very thankful because they provide a great protection for your brain. These do not move. Cartilaginous joints allow very little movement, and these are the joints of your pelvic girdle. Those are cartilaginous joints, and it's very important that they're cartilaginous joints, specifically for women, to allow for the birth of a baby, to allow those hips to widen, to allow the baby to squeeze through. And then we have synovial joints, and these are the joints that you and I typically recognize as joints. These are freely movable. Think about your fingers, your arms, your wrists, your elbow, your knees. They're freely movable. They are every articular surface. So the articular surface is anywhere where the bones meet. These are lined with cartilage to allow for a smooth movement. And within that joint, there's a capsule that contains synovial fluid. We call this the bursa. And all of this is reinforced with ligaments in order to maintain the bone-to-bone connection and to allow the muscles to work on the bones to move them. And we have all the different types of movement described here. We have flexion. It decreases the angle between the bones of the joint, bringing them closer together. Extension increases the angle between the bones. Adduction moves towards the body line. Abduction moves away from the midline. Rotation, it almost looks like this guy's head is spinning all the way around, but it's not because we can't do that. It's not possible. Rotation is moving around an axis. Circumduction is moving in a cone, which both your legs and your arms can do. And then we have supination and pronation. Supination moves the palm up, and then pronation moves the palm down. And the same would be for your feet. Rotating your feet outward if you will, from the ankle joint is supination, and then pronation moves it in. And that brings us to the conclusion of our skeletal system lecture. You should be able to list the functions of the bones, compare and contrast compact and spongy bone, explain both bone growth and development, describe bone remodeling, know the components of both the axial and appendicular skeletons, compare the structure and motion of the 3 joints, and that's it. Thank you for joining me. It's been a pleasure. See you next time.